You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. John is joined today by Brent Seales. Brent Seales is a computer scientist and digital restoration expert. He is the director of the Digital Restoration Initiative at the University of Kentucky. He has led groundbreaking work on the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Herculaneum Papyri, using advanced imaging and machine learning to recover hidden writings from scrolls too delicate or carbonized to physically unroll. His team revealed the earliest known copy of a biblical text inside the Engeddie scroll and is currently working to unlock the lost knowledge preserved in the Herculaneum scrolls, buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE.
Dr. Brent Seales, welcome to the program.
Good to be here, John.
Now, Doctor, I have to come out right from the start and confess something. When I was a little kid, I saw a volcano explode, Mount St. Helens, and I saw it from a distance of 40 to 60 miles, something like that. The distance from Portland to the mountain as the crow flies. And I saw what sticks in my memory is again, a little kid, was this gigantic column of ash going up in the air, which is called a Plinian column. And the reason it's called that is because Pliny the Younger was present in the Bay of Naples at the time, and his father was using the Roman Navy. He was an admiral. He was trying to get everybody out that he could, and he ended up dying in the volcano. But the fact is that Pompeii and Herculaneum are examples of a true natural disaster. And having seen one and being worried about it as a under 10-year-old at the time, that is scary, dangerous, chaotic, and unbelievably apocalyptic. Do you think, when you study these scrolls, do you think about the people that died in these apocalyptic volcanic eruption? And they were much closer to that mountain. Herculaneum is not far from Mount Vesuvius. Do you think about those people when you go through and you say, look, these scrolls are very important. We're saving literature that's lost literature from the distant past. But do you think about the human side of it?
Well, I do. I think about the people first, actually. And that's why I'm so intrigued by the writing, because the writing is where you find the stories. The writing contains the thoughts of the people, right? Everything else that we look at is a testament to the tragedy. We have artifacts that show what life was like and how life was ruined, right? But it's the writing that actually gets to the thoughts of the people. And so I think about that all the time, actually.
I think what bothers me about the Villa of the Papyri, and we'll get into your work in trying to read those scrolls soon, but the Villa of the Papyri shows evidence that they were trying to pack that library up and get it out somehow. There's actual archaeological evidence that they were trying to package this stuff up and get it out of there right in the middle of this eruption before the pyroclastic flows came that actually carbonized the scrolls. So there's evidence that this library was important to somebody. Even that, at the time, even after it may have been almost 100 years old or something like that, since Philodemus and I think it was Julius Caesar's uncle that may have owned this villa had been alive, they were still trying to save that. So what is the evidence that they were trying to get this stuff out?
Yeah, I've heard that the scrolls were found in places that weren't exactly like shelves in the library. They felt like maybe some of that material was being staged for evacuation, which I can certainly believe, because it was a literary and philosophical culture, and books were venerated because it was the collection of the knowledge of the day. And I mean, they had folks who were in residence, philosophers, and being in residence, right, they created this value of this unique library. And I absolutely can believe that they were trying to protect that because it was an incredibly valuable asset.
Yeah, especially in an age before mass-produced books. Now, some Stephen King novel, there's a million copies, or way more than that, actually. And if that gets carbonized, it's not really going to be all that interesting in the future. But here, in a world where scrolls are very expensive, and it requires literate people to be able to write them and do it by hand, Yeah, it would have been very valuable. Now, I remember hearing about the Herculaneum scrolls again in the 1980s, probably much later, and thinking to myself, man, if we could only read those, because we knew that they were scrolls, and people had been trying to decipher them and take them apart with razor blades and very, very invasive techniques, but most of them we couldn't tell. And in fact, there are parts of that villa that we've not even excavated yet because we don't know that we can even conserve it. So now everything has changed. What led you to try to digitally and non-invasively, which is an important word here, look at those scrolls and virtually unroll them, flatten them, and read them? What led you to this work?
Well, I came through the digital era of the 1990s, right, when everything became online, basically. And the digital library push led me to really believe that anything that was really hard to digitize was going to be left behind. And so I got intrigued by the digitally resistant, if you will, things that are hard to handle, difficult to digitize, even when you digitize them, difficult to read. So we invented the technology actually before I knew fully about the Herculaneum collection. But when I discovered the cache, of 400 or 500 scrolls that are unopened as of yet, and I realized I already have a technical approach that might actually work. I mean, there was no way I was not going to pursue that project. One of the best projects you can ever work on is one that you can describe to average people in a sentence or two. I can describe this project exactly like that. We want to read the damaged scrolls from Herculaneum without opening them using modern technology. That's it.
And it pays to remember the time frame here. Vesuvius exploded and destroyed Herculaneum, carbonizing these scrolls in 79 AD. This was over 2,000 years ago. And this is literature from the past echoing up to us that we weren't sure that we would ever be able to read, but we were tantalizingly close because the scrolls were there, but we weren't sure that we could read them. Now, ink. What kind of ink was being used to write these scrolls, or at least the ones you've examined so far, that you're able to get a trace of, just something that shows up on your scan that allows you to read this? What would they have been using to write these scrolls?
Yeah, the ink of the ancient world was pretty simplistic. For the most part, it was carbon black. It was basically soot ground up so that it was really thin and mixed with water and maybe gum arabic, which is kind of like a binder or a gummy natural substance that just would make the ink flow onto the page. But you get this really, really dark color. And that was pretty much it. It was a simple recipe. The Egyptians innovated much more around ink and pigments. But for the most part on papyrus, we see carbon black.
Now, I know you've also worked with later texts, medieval type texts, Byzantine texts, and things like that. And the ink, I assume, is different, more iron-based, iron gall type inks and things like that, which come with their own set of problems. Are those easier to read through your method than this, carbon-based ink from the first century?
Well, the whole idea of looking at a scroll while it's still wrapped up requires that we use diminished imaging method because you can't just photograph the page. And that diminished method is basically X-ray based. So the minute you go to X-ray, you have real problems if the ink is basically of the same nature as the page that it's written on. Iron gall is not like that. The iron-based inks are completely different from the parchment that they're written on. Iron is it's a heavy metal and the parchment is not. So X-ray loves that. And you can think about that ink as being kind of like the bones of your body, right? It shows up like crazy because it's much more dense than everything else in your body. That's true for the medieval ink, the iron ink, but it's not true for the ink of Herculaneum.
Now, you're faced with a number of problems here because not only are these scrolls rolled, meaning that page after page, if you can even call it that, they're all cramped together and seemingly from the scrolls I've seen very tightly. It seems like they're tightly rolled. How exactly do you layer that out and determine what sentence is on what level of that rolling? How do you keep it from a word jumble? How do you determine what's on what layer of that rolled scroll?
Well, our approach is the confluence of some amazing technologies over the last 100 years. X-rays were not even discovered before 1895. Okay, we didn't even know X-ray existed, right? Before a German physicist discovered them in 1895. And of course, we have tomography, which is the imaging method we use based on X-ray, to see everything going on inside, right? But even when you get a tomographic view of the complete internal structure, what you have to do then is isolate the place inside that tomographic view where the ink actually is. It's like the ink's not going to be floating in space, right? It's actually affixed to the page. So the trick is to take that scan and find where the surface of every page is. And if the pages were all like the pages of a book, they're all flat and they're lined up and they're, linear, which would be a mathematical term, but basically flat and straight, that'd be an easy problem. But the fact is, these scrolls, they're not rolled up in a nice little jelly roll. They're rolled up and then they're crushed in 5 different directions, right? So the problem of tracing where the ink actually is in that tomographic scan is profound.
Do you think that these scrolls, when the carbonization happened, do you think these scrolls were actually neater? In other words, they weren't distorted, or they were just rolled and sitting on shelves, and that the actual collapse of the roof from the volcanic eruption is what really distorted them and damaged them? Do you guys have any ideas about that?
Oh yeah, it was a working library. I think they were in great shape. I think every scroll was a beautiful wrap of, 100 wraps of a really long piece of papyrus, maybe 30 feet. It wasn't just the roof of the library. I mean, these things ended up buried by 30 to 50 meters. That's 90 to 120 feet of pyroclastic flow, basically mud, water, gas. You could still see in the archaeology that steep wall that they had to dig down through in order to find where these things were. So they were crushed by all of that, essentially.
It's just amazing to think about that much rock. And it's rock, pulverized rock, and that much of it was deposited that quickly. Although that did happen at Mount St. Helens, very close to the mountain, but still, it's just amazing to think that much effectively concrete of sorts can be laid down that rapidly and bury something like this, especially to the point not at Herculaneum, it doesn't happen there, but it happens at Pompeii, where the pyroclastic flow cooled a little bit before it got there, where bodies were preserved. You could fill in with plaster and cavities where people were and see what their last moment was like, which is very haunting. But it was a lot hotter at Herculaneum, which was closer, which is what saved these scrolls. Do you find any scrolls or any little bits and pieces of any other books in that area? In other words, do you find anything at Pompeii, or was it just simply not the conditions needed to carbonize the scrolls as it was at Herculaneum?
I don't think that they found any papyrus at Pompeii. I mean, I could be wrong about that. The Villa of the Papyri was really where they found the bulk of all the papyrus. And they certainly found other material like wood, furniture that was carbonized yet preserved. I do know of one instance where in one of the houses of Herculaneum, which is the town nearby to the villa, right, where they found some papyrus that they think might be documentary papyrus, not literary as part of a literary or philosophical library, but instead record keeping for the household, which is kind of interesting. But the answer is no, they didn't find much outside of the Villa of the Papyri.
Now, digital flattening, and you pioneered this technique with actually a completely different text, a Byzantine text, roughly medieval period, that was brought up before the fall of Constantinople by a Catholic cardinal and brought back to Italy. What were you doing with that book? In other words, this medieval text, which was not a scroll, it was actually a book and bound. I guess it was unbound, though, when they originally photographed it in the early 20th century. What were you doing there?
Yeah, that book in the Marciano Library in Venice is called the Venetus A, and it's actually the oldest complete copy of Homer's Iliad. It's a magnificent manuscript. But like most things from the ancient world, it's a medieval copy, right? We don't have the original. And what we were doing, besides just making a beautiful facsimile for a scholarly study, is that we were perfecting a flattening technique where we could image the pages as they sat, and they're not flat because it's parchment. They're wrinkled and the pages are curved. We would image them as they sat, and then we would digitally flatten those pages. And that's a precursor, right, to the problem of complete unwrapping, which we're applying to the scrolls.
The scrolls themselves, how many of them that people didn't previously try to unroll and read, how many of them that are left as found? Because a lot of these were found in the 18th century when excavations began at Pompeii and Herculaneum. How many of them are there for you to attempt to do this technique with and read, and how many more to go? How long does it take to work out one of these scrolls?
Yeah, we've been working for the last decade on just a handful to get to the point where we can scale up. But, the scrolls were discovered in around 1750, 1752. And when they were excavated, it's kind of heart-wrenching to say this, but some scrolls were burned because people didn't know when they first found them what they were. And then once realization set in, they were preserved and saved, and many of them were sacrificed completely in order to get a reading. In other words, they were cut open and then scraped so that there was no remaining evidence of the scroll, but there was just a sketch of what people saw as they were being destroyed. So in that sense, we don't really know the exact number. It's kind of murky, like how many got burned, how many were destroyed and then sketched exactly. What we do know is what remains, because we can actually count what's in the box, and we have between 400 and 600 complete hunks, many of which represent full books. I think the latest count from my trusted colleague and friend Federica Nicolardi in Naples, at the University of Naples actually, I think the latest count is maybe over 100 complete books, and then another 300 fragments that together might make another 100 books. It's a lot.
But, and this is the elephant in the room with this archaeology site, is that it's not completely excavated, and that we seem to have only one room of a potentially much larger library, and that eventually when we can excavate the rest of the villa of the Papyri, if we ever do, we may find a much larger library. Thoughts on that? Do you think that there's more there, or do you think this was just the personal library of probably Philodemus, Epicurean philosopher? Because these seem to center around his work, and he seems to have had a connection and lived in Herculaneum. You think there's going to be more? Are you ready for another 100 years of work if they find more of these scrolls?
Well, I was in the tunnels last week with Massimo Ossana, who is the director of museums and libraries in Italy. He reports directly to the Minister of Culture, who reports directly to Meloni. So these folks are intrigued and interested in the state of archaeology right now in Herculaneum. Massimo actually was the former superintendent of both Pompeii and Herculaneum, so this is near and dear to his heart. What I can tell you is that when you walk into these tunnels, which are the original Weber tunnels, right, from 1752 and onward, they run on the Roman mosaic floor, and they're just wide enough shoulder width to be able to get through, but that floor basically just goes under the dirt. And so in either direction, left or right, the rooms that you walk through are completely unexplored. So even if it was a personal library, and therefore, you're thinking that it wasn't that extensive in terms of the number of scrolls that might be there, there still could be a number of other artifacts and scrolls in those rooms that are unexplored.
Plenty of work to do. I think a lot of people tend to view an archaeological excavation as digging a pit, basically, and going down and looking at the layers and everything. They didn't do that in 1752 with the Villa of the Papyri. They dug tunnels. And this is like going into caves. Give us a sense of that. I mean, when you go into that and enter those caves, what's it like? And how did they find these carbonized scrolls in that as they dug?
Well, yeah, it's honestly like time travel. You go into the cave and immediately it's 300 years ago. It's the 18th century. And you see the evidence of that. And then you look down and you travel again 2,000 years ago because it's a Roman mosaic floor. And that's it. So you really can't help but think, how can we know that this is the site, right, of the only extant library from antiquity that's ever been discovered, right, in human history? And we're not going ahead and fully exploring the rest of what's there in the villa. I can tell you that modern archaeology is about stratigraphy. You start from the top and you work the layers down. But in this case, it's a unique case because we know that the top 30 meters, there's nothing. The modern village sits on top, and then it's the volcanic eruption from AD 79, and you can see it. So honestly, to do the excavation, you really need to start from where the villa is and then go down from there. And I think we have the modern tools to be able to actually do that without disturbing the modern town above, in fact.
That's actually really intriguing, is that the archaeology of this place starts and stops at 79 AD, exactly. And as a matter of fact, I think they've determined what month it was, like October of that year that the volcano went off. Virtually flattening, first step with reading the Herculaneum scrolls. So what do you do with that in a computer environment? And with machine learning and all of these tools that we have, AI today, all of that stuff, and I know you're a computer scientist, how does the computer do that? How does it determine how to first flatten the text in order to read it digitally?
Well, we assume that the shape of the page used to be flat. It's distorted now, right? And we pull out from the scan, from the volume, from the tomography, if you will, we pull out what the current shape of that page is now. And then we basically just do the mathematics to reverse that. We assume, okay, it was flat, it's not anymore. I mean, you do this every day when you do your laundry, John, right? Your shirt comes out, it's not flat, right? And then you flatten it when you fold it. And that's what we do, right? And mathematically, we try to do that in a way that minimizes the distortion of pushing it from the shape that it is to the shape that we want it to be, which is flat. And that way the text will look correct once we're done with that. But it's essentially, it's called a conformal map. Conformal map means that it's a distortion of something that was a flattened planar surface, but it can go back to a planar surface if you just do the right mechanics. And that's what we're doing.
Flattening the wrinkled t-shirt. I love it. So what language are these in? Are these Latin texts, which I guess you would expect for the Romans, or are they in Greek? What language is, when you hand this to the scholars, what are they seeing? What language?
A lot of the scrolls were opened, inadequately and by creating a lot of damage, but they were opened, and that fragmentary witness shows basically two languages. It shows Latin and it shows Greek. And the Latin that we've seen from those open scrolls is the minority. Mostly the texts are Greek. And so far, what we've virtually unwrapped is uniquely Greek. So we're actually really hoping that we can balance that out, because both the Latin and the Greek were part of the ancient library, and they usually actually divided the library based on the language. So to see more Latin, right, would indicate that maybe we're into that part of the library, and we'd like to see that happen.
That would be amazing, that if they were categorized like that, that tells you that there's a lot more, a lot more to be found. And with the ancient world, the Greco-Roman world, we're missing most of the literature. It just wasn't preserved. And we're dependent on medieval monks copying and preserving text secondhand, copies of copies. And we're looking at stuff that's original. And with Philodemus, all we ever had was excerpts. I don't think there were any complete texts. So once you read these things, how complete are they? In other words, is it 70% that you can read, 80%, 40%? What's the range there of being readable?
Well, you've put your finger on a really interesting point. From the ancient world, we have only, 5 to 10% of what was actually produced. So that 90 to 95% of what we've lost is just heart-wrenching, because these were incredible people, and it was an amazing point in human history. We are trying to show with the technology that we can read 100% of every one of these remaining scrolls, but that's an outsized, audacious goal because of the profound damage. What I can tell you is that machine learning is a kind of approach that always seems to improve, like with more data. So it seems like the more scrolls we're able to image and then process, the better all of them can be at what the text is that we can extract. So it's really hard for me to say what the upper limit is going to be. But if I had to take a guess right now, based on the optimism of our technical team and also based on my conversations recently with Nat Friedman, I would say we're gonna be above 90% for every one of these scrolls in being able to achieve a reading of what's actually there.
That's absolutely amazing. As long as it's carbonized, you got a good chance of deciphering it. Now, you're also going to have fragments. And when you deal with the fragmentary scrolls, where half of it's missing, the lower half of it or something like that, you can still pull out a lot, and the scholars can sort of reconstruct a lot of what was originally there. How far are you from that, trying to figure out the fragments? Are you focused mainly on the complete scrolls right now, or are you looking at the fragments because maybe there might be an easier path to deciphering them? How's that work?
Well, our goal this year is to image the first 100 scrolls that are still, in situ, that are still intact. And each one of those probably represents a unique book. They're not fragmentary. Well, once you get past that 100 number, then, you have scrolls that are broken in half, and then you have scrolls that are just sort of random pieces that might have been broken when they were excavated. Who knows? So we're not actually to the fragment part yet, but I think that reading, the first 100 and building what we need in terms of software scaffolding to read 90+% of those first 100 is going to be everything that we need to go after those fragments, which admittedly, the fragmentary stuff is going to be the hardest stuff, right? Because, it's pieces, parts. So not only do you have the technical challenge of scanning it, reading it, virtually unwrapping it, right? But then you have to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So it's like challenge upon challenge, right?
Do you enjoy it? I mean, are you having fun with this project, your life's work here? Is this enjoyable that, do you get that sense of accomplishment for every word that you pull out?
I'm stupefied, honestly, at where we are. And yeah, I absolutely enjoy it. I myself am shocked at the remarkable ability that we have with this technology to actually see this for the first time after 2,000 years. And so, yeah, I'm having the time of my life, and we're at the pinnacle of being able to read what's there and also being able to maybe influence future excavations. Like, I don't know how it could be better, honestly.
You got to wonder what other libraries out there, what else is out there, because you find other areas, archaeological sites like Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, where texts are coming out of there that aren't carbonized, but they're fragmentary and they were thrown in a dump, basically. What else is in the ground on this planet that we will find and possibly apply this technique to? What else can you apply the technique to? In other words, all right, you got the Herculaneum scrolls, but what other books and mysteries are there out there that intrigue you that this technique could be used to try to figure out these other texts out of Egyptian dumps?
Well, yeah, I mean, of course, we've thought about this, and there are other archives that simply have damaged material where this is a candidate. There are books that have been bound using cannibalized earlier manuscripts. So that means that the manuscripts are locked up inside the binding of another book. And you might be able to use this technique to see inside. There are some more fantastical, though, kinds of possibilities. Turns out that ships were sailing around the ancient world, especially when Alexandria, the library at Alexandria, was in play. And they were full of books because Alexandria was collecting and archiving, all of the ancient world knowledge before it burned. Some of those ships sank in the Black Sea, and you know what? That's an anaerobic environment. So people are now talking about the possibility of shipwrecks producing a large number of library material. And if that were the case, this would be the technique we would use to try to read them, right?
That actually is a topic in its own right, the Black Sea and the anaerobic environment there, because not only is it so oxygenless that very few microbes live there to eat anything, it may not have just preserved the scrolls, but there may be 2,000-year-old bodies on those shipwrecks that are perfectly preserved from that time period, or 3,000 years old, because the ancient Greek city of Chersonesos was in the Black Sea, and there was Greeks and Romans were there, at least parts of it. So that you've got that. But what about more modern texts, like, for example, the Baltic Sea, which also, it's not anaerobic. What it is it's very cold, and you can't get that. Also affects life that can eat manuscripts. But could there be manuscripts there from like the medieval period, for example, sitting there in the cold waters of the Baltic that might benefit from this if we can ever recover any of them?
Absolutely. I think there could be discoveries that would feed directly into these techniques in all of those places. And I know for a fact that existing archives like the cache of papyrus at Petra includes some badly carbonized pieces that were never able to be opened. Basically, this technique it works on the detritus, right, of collections. And oftentimes that's where more interesting material actually is, where we squeeze the juice, right?
Now, there's the possibility that the papyri that you're working with actually were the personal library, as I mentioned earlier, of Philodemus of Gadara, which was a now rather obscure Epicurean philosopher. But at the time, he was more well-known, and we had nothing from this guy, like I said. Do you have any evidence that this was actually potentially written in his own hand? in Greek, and I think he actually was Greek. Is there evidence that this is actually that personal and that really was his library?
We don't really know, and that's a really important question that is tough to answer. And so the way that you answer a question like that is to, have more and more examples of signatures and texts that come from the title and author that you're looking at. We do know that there were scribal hands in the existing open fragments that match up. And so scribes versus, original philosophers who were actually writing, really hard to tell. And of course, I want to make sure everyone knows that I am not the humanities expert, right? The papyrologist on this project. I am a computer scientist and I'm the engineer of this technology. So I'm speaking based on what I've learned from incredible partnerships, right, with people who actually know what they're talking about.
Yeah, and that's multidisciplinary, and that's going to be crazy important here because like you said, handwriting experts and all this are going to come in. What does with trying to figure this out though, from the computer side, what do your programs look like in this AI age where we're all talking to chatbots and everything like that and marveling over these somewhat scary technologies? What's your programming look like to figure this out? How much is actually autonomous, I guess I would say, is how much is the computer learning and figuring out and telling you what it's finding?
Well, we've written toolkits that are all publicly available in GitHub, so anyone who wants to look at the actual code can go out there and see the various pieces, parts we've engineered. But no, it's not so flashy, right, as to be an autonomous agent that we can basically talk to and say, hey, go read that Herculaneum scroll and come back to me in a day. It would be nice if we could get to that point someday. In fact, you've caught us right in the moment when we are trying to convert from semi-automated with a fair amount of human involvement, right, to the place where we are pushing a button that says, here's the latest one we've scanned, go unwrap it and come back to me when you're done, right? The only way we're going to really be able to do this work at scale is to have scaffolding and tools that work closer to that level than where we are right now.
So when you started working with this stuff in the 90s, how different is it of a computer environment from now versus what you were doing back then?
I'll tell you, we would say this in Western New York and out West. I'm sure people are familiar with the phrase being out over your skis. I was out over my skis for a long time because we were envisioning doing something that the technology just wouldn't let us do. In the 90s, there was no cloud computing, right? We didn't have the capacity to get the spatial resolution that we needed, the very fine-grained scans that were necessary to be able to see all the detail. I mean, the scans we're getting right now, every voxel in that scan, a voxel is like a 3D pixel, right? Every voxel is the size of a strand of silk. It's that fine. So you need a lot of memory. And then the AI that we're running, of course, is running on NVIDIA GPU type clusters that do billions of computations, right, per unit time. And none of that existed in the 90s. So, I mean, everything came in underneath the vision that we had for doing this work.
Weird history. Now, some of the scrolls were in France, right? And the way that they got to France, having been excavated in the 1750s, was Napoleon Bonaparte bringing them back when he was on his conquests. What were those like, the ones in France?
Yeah, originally we weren't able to partner with the Italian group in Naples. And so we found out that there were 6 scrolls in the Institut de France that were gifted to Napoleon. And he brought them back and put them in the library of the Institut de France, which is now the Académie Française. It's the National Academy of France. And that gave us an avenue forward, even though we weren't able to work directly with the cache of many hundreds of scrolls in Italy. Those were authentic scrolls from that domain, right, that were given to Napoleon. So those actually were a huge part of our start, being able to have access to those scrolls.
That's something to think about, is that maybe Napoleon actually saw them when they were gifted to him, and he was wondering to himself, I wonder if anybody will ever be able to read those. And here you are, that's 2 centuries or 2.5 centuries later.
You know, I gave a talk at the Institut de France about the work because I wanted to thank the Institute for partnering with us and allowing us to do that work. And I made that point. I said, you know what? These scrolls probably came directly from Napoleon's hand. And I mean, how interesting is that to think that from his hand, right, to our eyes, and now we're reading it.
Yeah, but if they came directly from his hand, he probably had to wash his hands afterwards because of the carbon. And there were words lost on the fingers of a French emperor from for
Maybe,
1810,
maybe.
something like that. So, what else do you anticipate if you were to find a dream text? Because again, most of the world's ancient literature is gone. What would you love in a dream to find in the lower levels or other areas of the Villa, the Papyri?
A lot of people interpret that question as being, what's the probability of finding, this, that, or the other? But I usually interpret it as, what's in my heart, right? What's my desire? And the first century was an incredibly interesting time in human history. The first thing I would like to find is anything that is a history, because that's like asking the genie for three more wishes, right? Because a history is more than just a story, right? It tells you about other things going on. So one of Livy's lost histories of Rome or any other sort of unknown documentation of things that were going on in the ancient world would be just a tremendous discovery. The second thing, of course, is that all of the world religions were emerging in the first century. So you have early Christianity, you have Judaism, and you have eventually Islam a few centuries later. So I would love to find anything that hints at the origins of the world religions, especially early Christianity. If we found anything in Herculaneum, it would instantly become the earliest witness of early Christianity that we have, period. So what kind of a discovery would that be? That would be just incredible. I mean, I know that we have everything from the tail end, right, of the Greek and Romans, but the first century was also the beginning, the genesis, right, of the next era. And so who knows what might be there.
That was something in preparation for this interview that I was thinking about last night. Was okay. This is right at that time, as you say. 79 A.D. is not very long, much longer after the beginning of Christianity. And as somebody that likes books myself, I've got all kinds of. I'm not religious myself, but I have all kinds of books about world religions. Maybe this guy did too, that assembled this library, which again was supposedly Julius Caesar's uncle originally owned this villa, and that there could be anything there. There could be anything there because if you're interested in books, you're probably interested in all kinds of books, wouldn't you think?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think if I walked through your house and grabbed a random book, who knows what I might find, right? It would be skewed toward, your particular interest, but you still have a wide range of things in your library, right? And so I know from, what we have in the Bible that it says that the Apostle Paul visited with Christians in the area on his way to Rome. And, those Christians had writings and they were in the Bay of Naples, right? So the writings of early Christianity were circulating in about AD 50, which is, a full 20 or 30 years before the volcanic eruption. I mean, maybe they had a current events section in the library and we just haven't discovered it yet, right?
God, could you imagine that, a current events section preserved from the first century? It's sort of like resolution in a way. We have low resolution because we have so few documents from that period, but they had a lot more, and there was a lot more going on than our superficial look 2,000 years later would say. And even just a newspaper, something like that, even just imperial decrees from whatever emperor that was, I guess it was Titus at that time, would be just mind blowing. Even financial records. We sold this much olive oil to this group and things like that because they had very modern things back then, like corporations and branding. You'll find in Rome, there's this giant hill of shattered amphoras. It's a trash heap. And these amphoras actually have the brand of the olive oil and the wine and all of that, these very modern things. And the Romans had that, and such things could be preserved in the lower sections of that library. Now, the villa itself, what else is there? What else have they found in the villa other than the papyri? Did they find carbonized furniture, skeletons, things like that?
They did find human remains, yeah, all across Herculaneum, just like Pompeii. And again, it reminds us of the human tragedy and the scale of the human tragedy. But all of those households were fully furnished. If you go to the Archaeological Museum in Naples, and I recommend everyone, to all your listeners, that they make the trip because it's stunningly beautiful. And there are oil lamps, there are candelabras, places, window treatments, furniture, And the bronzes of the villa are just really unparalleled. One of my favorites, of course, is a little whimsical. It's a bronze sundial in the shape of a prosciutto ham, right? You hang it on the wall and it's decorative. And in the right sunlight, it also tells you what time it is, right? How great is that? Of course, there are also marbles in fully formed Roman marble statues. I mean, just tremendously beautiful.
That's one of my favorite things about Bapati's archaeological sites, particularly Pompeii, where they show images of food that still exists, like in the case of the sundial prosciutto ham, but also there's something that looks suspiciously like some kind of a pizza depicted at Pompeii, but even more importantly, also carbonized as bread at Pompeii. And you can buy that same loaf of bread in the same shape with the same sort of divisions in Naples today. And that people have just kept that loaf of bread style that entire time. And you can just recognizably look and see this carbonized loaf of bread, and it's the same thing. Probably tastes the same, although might have better techniques of grinding wheat nowadays than what they had. But that was hard on the teeth. Ancient teeth get worn because of grinding wheat. But when you look at it in context, what else is related to a library that they found there? In other words, all right, so you've got all of these scrolls, but there are things that go along with scrolls, like pens and writing utensils and, quills, things like that, what they would have used. Do you find any of that stuff? Does it look like there was actively a writing tradition going on in this library that might point to the activities of Philodemus, or is it just a dirty old neglected library?
Well, my understanding is that they did find hints of an active library. They found the shelving that probably held the scrolls. I think they did find some accoutrements, and certainly they found wax tablets, in various locations that were used for kind of temporary scratch work. But you have to understand that this was the birthplace of archaeology, but it wasn't really fully formed archaeology. I mean, they tunneled, okay? So I think a lot of things were probably lost and not carefully documented. And even though Carl Weber, the Swiss engineer who documented as well as he could what was happening in 1752 and onward, even though he did that, archaeology did not mature until, the next 100 years plus, right? So have to believe that coming back with modern archaeology and fully exploring the villa would have to become top of mind, top of the list of what we want to do next.
Now, possibilities of other libraries. Herculaneum is only partly excavated. Is there the possibility that we might run into yet another entirely separate library full of carbonized scrolls because of the conditions of preservation of the Villa of Papyri?
The whole area is, of Herculaneum and environs is riddled underneath that pyroclastic flow with what was there in AD 79. It's completely unexplored, largely. We have the villa and the Herculaneum proper because of the 1752 well diggers, who discovered it. How you do that, how you discover what's there, unknown. But to me, it's completely and entirely possible that there are multiple libraries in the area. Absolutely.
Now, there is a town above it. How do they balance that with an active town being sitting on top of the archaeological site that actually, as I recall, has a name that's a modern Italian version of Herculaneum, as I recall. What's that town like, and how do they balance the archaeology with, the active town?
Yeah, it's Ercolano, I think, and modern towns up above. And unlike Pompeii, which kind of cleared out, right, all of the private property, and so they've continued their excavation. Unlike that, Herculaneum does have the modern town just adjacent, right, to the scavi, the remains of Herculaneum and the villa. And I think it's actually an uneasy alliance. It has to be. The town wants to live its modern life, and the ancient town is there, and it's undeniable its value and importance. So far there's been coexistence. I believe, just like reading the scrolls without destroying them, invasively, right? Just like reading the scrolls without opening them non-invasively, I think we can do further excavation without impinging on the life of the modern town. I think we just have to do what humans always do, right? We put our minds to it and we do the engineering.
That's actually a big problem with the city of Rome, is that, how do you balance the archaeology? Because literally the entire center of the city is sitting on archaeological sites, and you just do what you can when you can. Something burns down, so you excavate, and then you build something new there and leave the excavations in the basement or something like that. And it's interesting because you got to wonder, what would the Romans have thought of archaeological sites from their days, Etruscan sites and things like that? Were they interested? And I suspect they were, because Julius Caesar himself collected ancient Greek coins. They were already hundreds of years old by the time he started. He collected them, and it seems that they had a sense of the past, not as extensive as ours today with archaeology, but I wonder what they thought of older ruins that they would come across and didn't really know who built them or what had happened.
Yeah, I don't know. I know that even the library itself, it didn't contain scrolls that were written that day. I mean, I think some of the scrolls, even in Herculaneum, were several hundred years old. They were collected as reference material for, the philosophy of the day. And one thing I didn't mention about the beauty of Herculaneum and the villa are the mosaics on the walls, and also the floors, the beautiful mosaic floors, the tiled floors. Those embedded a kind of pattern and sensibility and style that came from the ancients, like the Belvedere floor, which that pattern is incredibly beautiful and geometric.
Yeah, it's amazing. And that's one of the best preserved things in both of these sites are those floors. And the Romans certainly liked very decorative floors. They liked their mosaics. But those continued on, that tradition, because you go into churches in Europe and it's cosmati floors. They're not mosaics per se, but they're similar. And that tradition continued. Now we just make carpets and concrete, which is a little bit disheartening. All right, Doctor, thank you for joining us today. It's fascinating work, and I'd always hoped one day we'd be able to actually read these scrolls just to see what's in them. And you're actively doing that, and they're people from the ancient world echoing to our times, telling us what they knew.
Well, thank you very much for letting me join your show. I appreciate it.